Hey, welcome to Mobiuscast. I am Dan, and this is
Jeremiah,
Jeremiah. And I are more than a couple decades now into our both,
long-term friends and creative partners,
yeah, and which
collaborators.
manifests itself often, especially on the collaborative side, under the Mobius Project, where there has been and still is music creation and art and writing, lots of different projects that are always in the works. But one offshoot too is
Rarely finished, but always in the works.
try to put finishing touches on as we can go because it's a little bit more of a low bar for us is this podcast that we started more than a decade ago on Maui and have revisited now that we have less time to really like create things, but we still have the ability to talk through things and get inspired and think about the creative process. So that's sort of our intention here. And for today's topic, we started a an interesting conundrum of a conversation because we have our own experiences and perspectives on this subject, and we also have our own intentions for possibly like using it or not using it. And I don't know about you, Jared, but I am like so new to this, and my feelings and thoughts and philosophies and ethics around it are so still very malleable and unformed. I'm pretty ignorant about a lot of it and inexperienced. So I had some ideas, but what we thought we could do is have an open and honest discussion about what this is, where we're coming from with it, and maybe see if that could help inspire or inform what the next steps would be to either use this in some way or not. That's what we're going to be looking at. And I've been beating around the bush, but we are talking about so called AI here. And what we were just talking about right before we officially started, I think is a perfect starting point, is giving a little like context and maybe some history about what this is on a technical side and what it isn't. And the place that I want to start with talking about AI before we get into all
Mhm.
of our intentions for it and everything is the use of the moniker AI, which I feel is a misnomer. And correct me if I'm wrong, because you can correct me because I'm usually wrong, and you know a lot more than me because you're smarter than me. But this is true. You can't
Doubtful.
deny it. In my, mostly inspired by or it's like everything that I know I learned on TV, right? I've done a lot less research and gone down fewer rabbit holes when it comes to filling my head with useful knowledge than useless knowledge. And one of those things is, when it comes to talking about like modern technology and where it's headed and what it's gonna do to humanity in good and bad ways, is based on things like 2001 and Terminator and no, like honestly, like like the idea of AI to me has always been sentience. Something cannot have an intelligence if it's not thinking for itself. That's always kind of been my understanding of what we mean when we say an artificial intelligence. The fact that, and this has only been in the past, I know this stuff has been around, these algorithms and these databases and systems have been around a lot longer than they have been more mainstream popular like they're becoming right now. But is AI, as we refer to it now, actually AI? And you were just getting into that when you were talking
Mhm.
about, does it think? And so, first of all, is my definition wrong? I haven't even looked it up, honestly. But is my
I,
definition wrong that AI is something that can think for itself, that
well,
we
I,
that is created by us?
well, I mean, I'll say yes and no. I mean, I think two things that you said there specifically. Like, first off, you're talking about the place that you are at with all of this is like, I think where most people are. I think we're still super early on in the broader cultural zeitgeist of dealing with grappling with what it actually means, because for so long it has been the realm of science fiction. And that's the other thing that he talked about is the idea that science, like a lot of the definitions of things that you pull for this kind of stuff is from science fiction.
Hmm.
And I think that is, I mean, look at all of the tech and stuff that Star Trek inspired, right? Science fiction has a role to play in inspiring people to dream and think about what's possible and therefore try it. So there absolutely is this like science and tech following behind science fiction as
Like a universal translator or
right.
warp speed.
It's like
Yeah.
it's like science fiction is the dream that people have, and then they wake up and they ask themselves how much of that could be real, and it inspires them to pursue. And so
Yeah.
science fiction has absolutely led technology, real technology, very real. Now, in terms of like your definition of intelligence, I don't think you're wrong. I think that's the way most people think about it. The problem with the people who actually work in this space is that defining thinking is a monumentally difficult task.
Mm-hmm.
Right? What does it mean to think? So when you say my definition is it can think for itself, well, if you can sit in front of a computer and have a conversation, you might be fooled that it's thinking, but it depends on the questions you ask and the logical traps that you set for it and whether or not you're out to catch it or just out to be convinced, because it can be convincing based on the responses that it has. But what you mean is something more internal, something real, something that might be harder to define.
Yeah.
And so like there is a piece of, when we use artificial intelligence as a name for things that are actually real and happening right now, there is a kind of intelligence to it. I think the important thing is to remember that the intelligence as you mean it is still the human being behind creating the thing.
Okay.
But it can think and respond to conditions that are set to it, which for some people is a definition of intelligence. It can
Sure.
respond to stimuli, and it can do very complex things up to and leading up to like writing its own code in certain circumstances, if
Right.
that's the condition that has been given. When you write an AI program, oftentimes it's a very simple set of circumstances, and it's often number feedback, right? And you have one part of the program that's set to measure one particular number. You think of a photograph,
Yeah.
and it's trying to decide whether or not something is in that picture, a dog or a fire hydrant or whatever. And the parts of the program are only looking at individual pixels or small clusters of pixels, and they're kicking out a number value. Well, you have to have a lot of those, right? Neurons, they call them neurons. You have to have a lot of those working in tandem and to decide to make a decision overall. This neuron is set to read this part of the photo. This neuron is set to read this part of the photo. This neuron is set to read this part of the photo. And you've got hundreds of thousands of those. And then it looks at all parts of the photo. And when it kicks back certain values across all of those, more than likely there's a traffic light in that photo. And then sometimes it's gonna then apply that set of circumstances to another photo and have to be told if it's right or wrong. And sometimes it's going to be right. And so then it's going to reinforce that set of values equals fire hydrant. And sometimes it's going to be wrong. And so then it's going to have to adjust, like it's going to have to take in the new photo, then read it the same way it did the first one, and adjust its calculations to say, okay, both of these are fire hydrants, but that one's not. So it's a series of comparative values, and they call each of those things that are measuring individual pixels or small clusters of pixels, a neuron.
Okay.
And once it learn, and it is learning, which is a characteristic of intelligence, it can learn.
Okay. Yeah.
So it is learning. Once it learns and trains itself on impossibly huge data sets, then it gets really good at it. And then it can use that information, say in facial identification or and recognition, or it can use that data to measure, like to identify changes in a setting. A camera can be watching a specific area and it can identify changes in the setting. It's not noticing that there are people. It's not identifying people because it's like aware in the way we are.
Right.
It's not hungry. It doesn't have to sleep. Like, it doesn't have those kinds of limitations, but it can notice changes because it's so good at recognizing the status of that because it's learned.
My introduction to this idea was machine learning, which is part of the process for AI to function, right?
Right. Well, that's the process of what I'm talking about, the training of the data sets.
So I guess I was just like kind of stuck on that when I was talking about machine learning, hearing about machine learning for years, and we were using it for our like robotics program for certain things that the robot couldn't do and
Right.
react to. All of a sudden, everybody's talking about AI is here and AI is happening. And I guess I was like, is it really? Is it really AI? Is it really like Skynet? That's thinking and protecting itself and it has a sense of self and awareness. That's I think maybe I was like kind of stuck on my own science
Well, those two
fiction
things are
definition.
different. Those two things are different. A sense of self and awareness. Like when we talk about machine learning, you absolutely can program a computer to learn. And I think
Right.
in that way, you can say it can get better at something, and therefore it can become like it can have an awareness of whatever it's programmed to have. Facial recognition is a kind of awareness,
Okay.
but a sense of self is different. And that might be where the reality of intelligence starts to differentiate from what you're talking about as intelligence. We talked about this sort of the last time we talked too, in the context of the story we had written, which is like, what's the fastest or what's the most logical way to get to aware machines? Is it to map and replicate the human brain? Because we talked
Right.
about the incredible storage capacity that it would take to even like contain a map of all the connections within a human brain. Or is it to just create something that can kind of replicate that process? And then you're talking about black box AI.
Right.
And black box AI is the best hope for deep space exploration because it's self-replicating and it writes its own program and it's adaptive, which you can
Okay.
do. And like a black box AI just means that like at some point in time, the programmer, the person who started the program, it taught that program to respond and adapt itself to taught a program to write its own program. And at some point in time, you have no idea where the stuff is happening in there anymore because you didn't write all the program. The program wrote
Right.
large chunks of the program. And so now all of a sudden, if you try to look inside, you have no idea what you're looking at.
Wasn't that was kind of what the new Mission Impossible movie was predicated on, I think. Did you see that?
I did
The
not.
Entity? Oh, I'd recommend it. It was very good.
But that's, I mean, well, that's the basis of Skynet. In the
Right.
old science fiction stuff is like Skynet became, and I'm using heavy air quotes, became self-aware.
Or The Matrix.
Or the Matrix. At some point in time, that program that was set loose and taught to learn
Yeah.
that met that definition of a human being that is self-aware and has an internal identity of self, and it protects itself, which is the fundamental like concept of Skynet. It protects itself.
Yeah.
And it decided that human beings were what had to be wiped out, and it has a sense of self, and that's the Matrix and the robots that have identities and the programs that have identities, even though they have functions and personal identities. But it's a complex issue because we still don't know what makes us aware. Like you can't crack somebody's skull open and find the part of them that's them.
Yeah.
Think about the case, when you study psychology, there's that famous case of the railroad worker who was like the nicest person you'd ever met and everybody loved him. And then one day he was in a horrible accident and a spike drove up through his chin and out the top of his head. And miraculously he survived. But it
Right.
damaged a part of his brain, and now he was a completely different person. He was sullen and angry, and people didn't recognize him, and he didn't get along with his like loved ones anymore. Like a part of his brain was damaged, and he was alive. He was still aware. He had an identity, but suddenly he's totally different.
Yeah.
Is that the part of the brain that's identity? That's you? That's the spark of life, and this is where religion comes in. Like, is the brain the soul, and the soul and the identify? Like, your brain is a collection of like physical matter and goop that we can't identify which part of it is and isn't you.
Yet.
Because you can lose parts of it and still be you.
Yeah.
So it's not the collection of the whole. And the concept of the soul, the idea that there's part of you that doesn't live in the physical or that can transcend the physical. That's why concepts like that are so prevalent, is because we can't identify which part of your brain is you. If I took your brain out and stuck it in another person, would you still be you?
I'd love to go down that whole rabbit hole, but
Well, but it's
Let's
pertinent to AI. It's pertinent
it
to
is.
AI.
It is. Well, these are all really interesting questions, but let's kind of refocus on what AI is right now.
Sure.
And I guess I think you've convinced me to keep using that moniker, even though I was always kind of hesitant since it's gotten popular. Anytime some new term becomes talking point, or a buzzword, I'm always a little like, okay, is this going to get overplayed, or is it even
It's a
accurate?
shorthand. It's a shorthand, but there's levels to it.
Yeah, that's what you're saying. I like that. Okay, so but with where we are right now, in a practical way, let's talk a little bit about. You were explaining to me recently about what this whole conversation is predicated on. Is should have maybe led
Led
with
with
this.
this.
Yeah, what I'm actually getting at, this whole conversation is predicated on, is it occurred to me recently that this story that I've been baking for many, many years, that you've heard me talk about on several different channels of my media output in this podcast, is I've been always looking for a home for it ever since the original graphic novel that I started with my brother stopped being produced because we got, life changes and got busy, and he lost interest in trying to sustain such a huge project. I've considered writing a novel. I've always envisioned it, of course, as a film because that's just how I prefer to consume story and how I enjoy it most often. The story is called Kanaloa. It's about my experiences living on Maui, where Jeremiah and I lived together for a couple years, and then leaving, and my emotional fallout from that. But then also a lot of the big, more philosophical questions about, where do people belong, and is there any righteous place, or ownership of any place, and all that kind of stuff, on the big thematic side. But on the more practical side, it's like I've toyed around with different ways of trying to tell the story because it's something that I just feel compelled to get out. And more recently, because I was introduced to, obviously, I think a lot of us have been introduced to Chat GPT as like an entry point into the AI boom that's happening right now. But I was also introduced to Midjourney and dall-e and some of these image creation AI programs kind of late last year, or last school year, towards the end of the year. And one of them was the soon to be released in beta Adobe Firefly, which, have you used that?
I have not.
It's very similar. You give it a text prompt and it spits out stuff, and then you refine it from there. So I decided, instead of like waiting and seeing like what happens with this, I was like, I'm just going to throw this into my classes because I do so much visual stuff anyway. I always start my classes off with Photoshop as like an entry point into using programs of that, complexity, and a lot of the tools and concepts apply to other programs, whether it's, 2D, 3D. I have the kids, get stuff from Google anyway. So I thought, hey, like what if we experiment with this thing, and this would be a good learning tool for me too, to actually use it in a practical sense than just kind of toying with it on the side like I tend to if I'm learning a new program or technical skill. If I'm not like having other people kind of beta test it for me and ask questions and get ideas and inspiration that way, then it's hard to fit it into my daily routine, as it were. So I've been using it for since the beginning of the school year in my classes, and I've been pretty astounded about what it can do,
Yeah.
because it occurred to me after a while, because like I wasn't familiar with that comic that you sent me, which was, do you remember what it was called?
Zariah of the Dawn.
I hadn't heard about that
And it's
before, but
not
when
the
I
only one. There's
oh
one called
I'm
the Beast. There's one called the Bestiary Chronicles, which is one that was sort of in the news about it. There's
Okay.
multiples.
Oh, I can imagine that, people that have much more foresight than me, because like we were there for the beginning of YouTube, and it never occurred to me at that time to like use YouTube as a
Yeah.
tool for expression and things. I was just watching like cat videos and, 10-second clips of TV shows and things. But other people had that, I've been on YouTube since day one doing my movie reviews and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, well, good for you. You have foresight. I don't have that. I'm not a good futurist. I'm living in the moment. I'm not surprised that people have been using these kind of tools to create things, especially people like me that aren't comfortable or experienced or refined with their fine art skills. And that's something that's always been really appealing to me about the relationship between, the art forms that I'm most passionate about, which are, I mean, especially in terms of like what I've studied and what I like to consume is visual narratives, mostly film and video and television, animation and things like that. But graphic novels too and comics have been a part of my passion in terms of visual storytelling from the beginning. I was reading those things as early as I was watching shows. I think part of that too is because, that like we were able to consume that stuff before. I mean, I'm speaking for myself here. I'm sure you were reading books when you were born, but because I rarely saw you not reading a book, in all the times we spent living together.
I like to
But
read and I have no friends. What can I say?
I'll be quiet. You're podcasting with one right now. I I love sitting down and reading a good book, and I was an avid reader as a kid, and I still try to be, though. It's been harder, just with time and availability and everything. But still, like when it comes to telling my own stories, at the time, I thought that maybe going to film school was a bit of a fluke or just like kind of a happenstantial coincidence that I just kind of fell into that haphazardly. And maybe I did, like in terms of like where I went to school, but I can imagine that I would have gone that way regardless, because as I've gotten older and I've thought about storytelling more and, indulged in it, I've really like keep coming back to the visual nature of it as opposed to the literary or mechanics of storytelling. To me, it's much more about how it hits the senses and what
Yeah.
that does to the emotions. And that's what really grips me about it. Because what I'm trying to say is that, like, I know some people really enjoy reading for the language and the language usage
Yeah.
and the
High art of writing.
yeah, the high art and the technical side of it. And same thing for film is even if like the characters aren't that engaging or the story, a lot of avant-garde people that enjoy, more like abstract avant-garde kind of film is because they can recognize the technical side of it that's really astounding to them, and they don't need it to be something more or different than that to appreciate it or to enjoy it or to be entertained by it or to be inspired by it. That was like the whole film program that I was associated with at the time at my school was run and founded and grounded in avant-garde filmmaking. It was all about form and color and light and editing and it wasn't about storytelling as much, or if there was a story it was much more implied and it was very metaphoric, and symbolic and visual. But for me it's like it's all those things together. That's a long-winded way of saying that, like, I really at this point, especially because I know like the economics and the limitations or the hurdles that it takes to actually like produce even low budget or no budget things take a lot of time, still a lot of money and a lot of logistics and everything. But I think back to when I was a kid and I tried to write a novel when I was in like fifth grade. I always wrote short stories and journals entries, and I wrote kind of pseudo theater. I didn't know the format and everything, but I had my grandma's old typewriter and I'd write like stage plays and stuff with dialogue. But the thing that I loved doing the most was making comics. And
Yeah.
I think a lot of that was because it was the closest thing I could do to making, a movie and put the visuals in my brain into something tangible as opposed to implying them through language. And so as much as I love reading and prose, and reading and indulging in that kind of stuff, it's just not something I've ever really been as inspired or passionate about creating. And then so when I found screenwriting, that like really kind of came full circle for me, where I realized like, oh my God, I can use limited and very structured formatting of language to tell a story. Still, like, it was a limited medium with an unlimited potential to work on our senses, to get that emotional response, to tell the story, and with all the different various tools that were available, that were auditory and visual
Well, I think that's one of the reasons you and I bonded over comics. Like, I like to write and I love to read, but I'm essentially a visual artist at heart. And
Yeah,
you are similar. You like to read and you appreciate writing, but like you're a kind of movie maker by heart and a storyteller by heart. And one of the reasons why you and I bonded over comics, I can still remember some of the initial conversations we had where sort of we realized, like, hey, comics and comic making, there is a relation to kind of movie making. And so that's like a middle
yeah,
ground between what I do and what you do, because it's a visual translation of a developed story in the similar process. It's sort of like the movie making process hijacked at a point to become visual art of a
yeah.
2D form instead of a movie form.
But
In
also,
fact,
but much more accessible way of creating and producing it, because it just takes like
yeah.
a few people as opposed to a huge production team, and the
Well,
the cost is so much lower.
it can be, because the modern comics are still like the
Oh,
person who does letters is different from the person who does inks,
right.
is different from the person who does colors, is different from the person who does pencil work, is different from the person who
Absolutely.
created the idea, is different
On
from the person
on
who
a
does the storyboards and scripts. Like,
professional sense. But I'm saying
but
that, like,
but it
if
can
if
be. It
I
could boil down to
if I was a
one person
visual,
creating a labor of love if they want to.
right. Well, and I think we're, just like with the technology has kind of closed the gap with, people that don't have the money or resources,
Mhm.
or time, and production team and everything can still make films and everything because the technology is kind of brought together. So there's fewer people that need to be involved, and you can have a more focused, less collaborative vision if you wanted to. You have more control over the vision from start to finish.
And you don't even have to print comics these days if you want to.
Exactly.
There's a comic that I really love and I actually use in a lot of my comic classes and things, like when I'm teaching kids about writing scripts and digital comics. It's called The Dreamer. Like, I think that there are print editions of it, but it really only ever started online that I'm aware of. And that's where I've read the entire comic. The artist puts up some of the like scripts and some of the storyboards and things like that. And it's done by, at least it started, I believe, it's done by this girl named Laura Innes, who did all the artwork and everything. And then it kind of blew up her art career from there. And now she does all kinds of other stuff, but you can still go online and read The Dreamer online. And she produced like one page every, like, I forget what the exact schedule was, like a month or a week or something like that. And now I think it's kind of tailed off because she got really popular and the comics went into print. And so like then the budget became enough for her to like
Hmm.
actually go the more traditional route. But you can still find 3 or 4 editions. I'm talking like trades collected, like editions of the comic, like online. You just go read it
Yeah.
online. And you can actually see her art style evolve from the beginning of the comic until the end. You can tell that she was like a less experienced artist at the beginning and like did this long-term project and got to the end. And you can go to
Hmm.
like thedreamercomic.com. It's like a really good story in which you can actually watch an artist evolve. And it's just because like it was almost like a labor of love at the beginning, you have to
Yeah.
imagine. And now it's like she has actually a full-fledged like artist, art career, like the whole nine. But like I teach the kids about webcomics because if you want to, you start a blog. I know it's not really in fashion anymore, but you start a
Yeah.
blog or an Instagram page or whatever, and just like throw your comics up there a couple panels at a time. And there are comic artists who do that. They just have an Instagram page
Yep.
and they create comics and they write their stories, whether they're like 4-panel comics or whether they're full page stuff, and they throw it up on Instagram. And there you go. There's your
Yep.
storytelling and there's your accessibility and there's your discovery. And you
Yeah.
didn't need a huge budget or a ton of time or, whatever to buy your name before anybody could see your stuff. And I mean, that's the beauty of the internet in general.
That
But
was the intention when my brother and I first started that Kanaloa, was that's what, yeah, we were putting it up one page at a time whenever we could get to it. I was hoping too it would be a long-term ongoing thing. It just got too much, especially
it's
as the
hard.
story got bigger. So yes, so I've backburnered it all these years. And then, in my experience with that kind of stuff with you and me too, we found that a lot of times intentions and hopes are less
Ambitious.
realistic and very ambitious than what our realities are. I just really am feeling now more than ever like to like get this thing produced in some way and get it out and not have it, like take another decade. That's why I started to think about the whole AI angle, which I've experimented with a little bit, but I have no idea if it's actually conducive to like, creating art for my story in a holistic and, comprehensive kind of way. Because I could see it running into a lot of different hurdles with, trying to get a certain panel a certain way, but it doesn't understand what I'm trying to do or what exactly what I want. But that's why I also thought, what if AI was just sort of like a starting point or an extra tool in my tool bag? Because I'm not an illustrator. I know that I can get stuff done quicker and with all the other hurdles on the way of getting stuff done and just created. Because for me, I'm more compartmentalized than you. I am a perfectionist to some regard. Like I like things to be quality, but they don't have to be if I know that it's going to go on forever. Because I let things kind of weigh on me, and they're always bubbling in my brain if I don't just put it out there, put a bow on it, even if I know that it's not up to my standards. I mean, just to watch like any of my YouTube videos, none of them are at the quality level that I would like them to be, but I don't care because I have to finish something before I start the next thing. Otherwise, I feel like anxious about that loose end. It's just a personality trait with me. So I've tried with Dave. It just didn't work. You and I have talked about it in the past and we haven't really revisited it. So that's part of this conversation. But just in general, like my kind of starting point is, would it be possible and more conducive in terms of like, my lifestyle, time, and my resources to do this thing on my own as much as possible using AI as one of the tools, but I also, like I know how to use Photoshop, so I can use other things too. It wouldn't just be like I'm only relying on AI to spit out what I tell it to, because I know it won't be exactly what I want. And I'll have to manipulate things and I'll have to edit them and change them and combine things and whatever. I also know that with concept art and everything, it's not something I can even do. So I'm gonna have to, rely on other people or a computer for that anyway.
So you can use it for any stage. It's about asking questions, about asking the right questions or giving the right prompt. And that's the crux of the argument behind AI art being art created by a human. The interesting case of Zariah of the Dawn. So originally Zariah of the Dawn, and the reason why it's a notable comic is because it was given a copyright, right?
I read
As
up
a
on it. I read the Wikipedia
yeah.
article when you told me
So
about it.
it was given a copyright, and then the copyright was revoked when it was revealed that the artwork was actually generated by the AI. And where it sits now, as far as I'm aware, is that the story and like characters and everything are copyrighted by the creator, but the artwork is not,
Right.
because the court determined that the artwork needs a human consciousness in order to copyright. And so like what it has said, like what that says about the artwork generated by AI is that it does not have a human mind behind it. It does not have a creative hand in it, and that generating the prompts is not enough creative input to say that I am the artist. However, the accomplishment of Zariah of the Dawn is that panel by panel, this person went, and I forget their exact name, Chris something or other, panel by panel, they asked prompts, looked at the options that were given to them by AI,
Yeah.
and by the AI prompt, I think it was Midjourney was what it was created on, and chose panel by panel and put together these pages in the comic. At least that's my understanding of how it was created. So there was a selection process and there was intention, but the actual visual elements were not created. And so there is a creative process, I think, behind it. And that's the crux of the argument. That was the argument behind the artist to say, no, I created this. AI just made the images for me.
Right.
Because they had to ask the prompts, they had to figure out what they wanted it to look like, they had to choose from the options given to them by Midjourney, and then they had to piece it together. But the only thing that they've gotten credit for in the end is the story and the characters and the progression of the story across its like arc. but not the actual images in the comic book.
Before we move on from that, I want to go back for a second because the reason that this whole conversation was originally prompted was when I first threw this idea out to Jeremiah. He came back at me with some really interesting ethical issues around the generation of this so-called art that as an artist, I was really fascinated to know more because I understand, but really am not that well versed in like the technical processes that go into creating this art and how it is affecting or can affect actual artists and their lifelong developed skills and refined and practice over a lifetime. Now, computers are using what they created to give us different versions of their creations and calling it not theirs. Can you kind of go back to the history of how
Yeah.
AI art specifically is
So
generated and what the ethical implications are?
So first I have to say, like anything that opens up anything to a wider audience of appreciation, I'm usually very much in favor for. I hate gatekeeping. I hate it. And like one of the things that I try to, as an art teacher, that I try to put into my students is that like just because you're young and doing stuff that doesn't go into a museum, that doesn't make your art not real. And so it's this idea of like opening up that thing that is closed to a wider audience. Keith, the artist Keith Haring, one of his like big pieces in the wider art movement was that art didn't have to be in museums, and so he would draw with chalk in the subways, and like the idea that like his artwork was super valuable, but you could find it. And Banksy goes out and just like paints on a wall somewhere, and it's worth tons of money to the point where people will like chisel it out and miss the point of like why Banksy put it out where he did.
Yeah.
So like I'm usually very anti-gatekeeping, but this I see is very different. This is not gatekeeping, but it's one of the exciting things about AI art is that like I don't have to spend forever learning my skills. I can know what I want it to look like. I can go to an AI art generator like a Midjourney or something like that, and I can give it a prompt, and suddenly that thing that I have in my head, I can see. There it is.
That's really big for someone like me that has that inclination, that desire to create, to take their things from their brain and put them out there. But I don't have the practiced skill or developed skill to do that. And I don't think that's ever going to happen for me.
I fully get that draw. I do. I
Yeah.
get the kind of like attraction to that. There is a kind of piece of the art community that's like grumpy grandpa on the porch. Like, well, I spent so long learning all of these skills, and yet you can just go type in a sentence and get your image. And like there is a piece of the art community that feels like that way. And I understand that too. But like at the same time, new tech comes along and you adapt and you grow and things change. And like, okay, if anybody can create any image they want, what makes art special and new? Art has survived, like the art creation has survived all of human history of evolution, from drawing in caves to now. It's
Yeah.
going to survive the AI art revolution. Like it just is. So
Well,
it's
and
not even
isn't what's going to survive like the cockroach in this nuclear
I have
bomb?
particular feelings about it, and I'm happy to get into about
No,
what's
no,
going to
we'll get into
survive
that.
and what
But
it's going to do.
isn't what's going to
But
survive? Like, as I agree with you, but isn't what is going to survive is the intention behind it, is the human purpose for the expression.
it will adapt and it will change.
The mediums will, and the creation tactics
And
will.
even
But
even the intentions will. AI art cannot create a beaded funerary necklace for a Mesoamerican culture that is integral to a like particular, like it can't do that.
right,
And ultimately that is fundamental to a lot of human expression. And so there are pieces of art and art making and cultural expression that AI just can't touch no matter how good it gets.
Right.
And so like I'm not worried about art surviving the AI art revolution, which is why I'm not as concerned with the skills aspect of it. I genuinely think that AI art in the short term, at the very least, will, I had a parent today. I was doing parent conferences for my school, and a parent who is a graphic designer asked me straight up, his like child is an upper middle schooler and is in one of my like more intensive art courses, and asked me like, is this useful? Is it even useful for me to have my child intensely push this like focus on studying technique and materials and all this stuff if the
Yeah.
future of art is AI? And I'm a graphic designer, so like I work in the digital space, and yet I like have pushed her to do this because she likes art. But is it even valuable for me to do that if the future of art is AI? And what I said
Good
to him was that
question.
like, yeah, it is. It's a great question. And that's what I said straight up. I was like, that's a great question. First off, there's a whole piece of like we learn math, not just because everybody who studies math is going to become an astronomer or an engineer. Learning math teaches you to think logically in a way that using a calculator just doesn't.
Yeah.
I feel the same way about grappling with materials and about like creating pieces in old
Yeah.
school mediums and things, that like it teaches you things about creativity and problem solving and who you are as a creative thinker that doing AI art just can't. Like coming up with a prompt for AI just can't do. So there will always be space for learning that stuff.
Right.
In the short term, there'll be a resurgence of traditional materials, probably like oil painting will suddenly be renewed, because until AI learns to use a machine to paint oil paintings, until it does that,
Which it
like
will.
eventually probably, but human beings, that's a thing that we can do. We can draw with pencil, and we can paint and use chalk pastels and oil pastels, and we can sculpt, in ways that have like personal expressive things, and you can tell the difference. And until you can't tell the difference, there might very well just be a resurgence in traditional art materials that separates digital art from traditional art again, at least in the short term. So there's that.
What's your hang up though, and how does that
Yeah.
relate to
Yeah. So
the
my thing
the
is
way that this stuff is actually generated? Because I
the
wasn't as
ethical piece.
familiar.
And I do use the word unethical because of the people who want to just like go to AI and like, okay, I got a thing in my image and I'm going to come up with a good prompt, and then I'm going to choose the image, and then I'm going to claim the image as mine through AI. You have to realize the way that AI is trained. All AI that does anything is trained on impossibly huge data sets. Talked earlier about how neurons read values in small parts of a picture, and then they learn what's in that picture. Image generative AI does the same thing. It looks at huge data sets of photographs and drawings and paintings of human faces, especially like if you're asking it to generate something that looks like a painting. It is looking at paintings of
Hmm.
faces and learning how to doing the same thing it does when it identifies a fire hydrant, by identifying faces and learning that certain collections of values and color makes a face. And so when you ask it for the face of George Washington, it has these like impossibly huge data sets where it's looked at the faces of George Washington, been told that it's correct, these are the faces of George Washington, and it spits out something that has probabilities, that's based on probability of all the various ones that it's looked at. And when you say the keywords like George Washington crossing the Delaware with an eagle, flying the American flag, drinking a Bud Light, like it has these like huge data sets that it's looked at. We have to ask yourself where those data sets have come from.
Okay.
When the sort of internet revolution, it's talked about in music a lot, about how so many more artists are discovered now because the internet made it possible for anybody who could bang on a keyboard or strum a guitar to put their music out there and now be discovered. MySpace, you get the MySpace
Right.
pages with the musicians. In some ways, if you didn't do that, you were left behind. If you didn't put your art out there, if you didn't put your music out there, if you didn't put yourself out there online, because that became where people looked for these things. And then the streaming revolution brought a lot of heat down on Napster, but it changed the way we valued music
Yeah.
because you could get it. in quantity. Well, for visual artists, if you weren't willing to put your visual art out online, nobody was going to find you because your name alone wouldn't be enough anymore because the internet was flooded with images. And now you have people that like their whole Instagram account is just their artwork because it's how they get discovered and it's how they put themselves out there, and they're an amateur artist and they're trying to connect with work, people who will hire them for things, or they're trying to connect into the larger art world and get themselves recognized or connect with other artists. And so they put their whole body of work out online, Instagram, Facebook, gallery spaces, personal blogs. So all that stuff just lives on the internet. Well, AIs that have been generative AIs that can kick you out images, what they've been taught to do is to scour the internet and do what we call scraping. And it's just gathering or analyzing millions and millions and millions of these images, anything anybody put out. So artists were sort of forced to put out their artwork to survive, and now it's being used against them to train AIs on their artwork to then replace them. And literally it's causing, if you want a particular like fairly well-known artist to commission you a piece, but they're out of your price range, you could go online and say, we're talking about comics, and so you think about like famous comic artists, and when we were talking before, the artist that I used was like Jack Kirby, because Jack Kirby is like super famous, right? So tons of his like images are just out there on the internet. If you went to an AI image generator and you were like, I want an image of SpongeBob
in the style of
fighting One Punch Man in the style of Jack Kirby. Well, Jack Kirby is dead. Jack Kirby can't draw you that image. And even if he was alive, he'd be out of your price range. But you could still get that image of SpongeBob fighting One Punch Man in the style of Jack Kirby. And how did that AI learn how to do that? By scraping all of his artwork that is out on the internet without credit, without permission, and it's replacing him. And now you've got this thing about the recent like strikes among creatives, right? And part of that issue was replacing writers with AI. And where did they learn to write? Where did they learn to write?
From writers.
From those writers that they're now threatening to replace them with by scraping their work, because it's out there, because everything's out there. We were talking before about how ChatGPT is predictive text. ChatGPT isn't like thinking about what it wants to write and then writing something with an intelligence. It's determining the probability that one word follows the next. And when you ask it a really good question, or you give it a really good prompt, whether you're asking it for an image or a script, all you're doing is narrowing the data set that it's learned from. But it has to learn it from somewhere. So it has learned it from the people you're trying to replace with it. And that's where the unethical piece comes from, because they can't avoid it. They can't avoid having their work used for this purpose.
All right, that was really well articulated. I just want to reiterate for anybody that happens to be listening that this is a honest conversation that we didn't like pre-script or plan, because I'm genuinely new to this whole concept and I am really curious about all of the implications of it, because my first inclination was to be excited about, I am a non-illustrator, that I can generate my own illustrations to finally tell the story that I haven't known what to do with for more than a decade. And so I'm honestly and openly trying to gather as much information about, and considerations about doing this moving forward. So like, I don't have a set plan here. I don't know where this is going to lead. With everything you just said, I have a series of devil's advocate questions. Not necessarily I believe them or that I'm like, oh, you're wrong because I'm going to ask you this question. I don't have fully formed thought. I haven't processed all this. I don't have fully formed opinions on any of this. And also, I'm on your side, because I agree with you as I guess I'll call myself an artist. I like to call it more of a creative, because I don't know if most of what I make I would call art necessarily. But I really do value, individuals and their voice and what they have to express. And also, coming from a family of musicians, especially my father is a lifelong freelance musician. He is an artist in his own right. You know, he's a classical French horn player, which you can hear more about on I think it's episode 13 of my music cast, where I interviewed my dad about his lifelong horn playing journey. But you know, I value the professional and I value the skill and the work. I mean, my father, you know, I grew up watching him practice and still do 3 hours a day every day. That's a big time commitment and a
Mhm.
big dedication that, you know, I just respect so much for, because, you know, I have a hard time focusing on a task for 20 minutes and he can practice for 3 hours. It's pretty amazing to me. And he's still passionate
Creative
about it, you know,
hero.
like 55 years into his career. What was that?
Creative hero right there.
But I'm just saying, like, I just want to make it clear, I'm coming from a place of absolutely like prioritizing and respecting the artists and
Yeah.
their autonomy and their recognition and their credit for what they've done and everything involved in that. But to try to fully understand this thing and to see if it's something that I should just shelve and completely forget about because it's unethical, and I that's not the kind of person that I ever want to be, especially in this area of art and creation expression, is to do something that has any kind of like lack of authenticity or is theft, or you know, even if it's not harming somebody directly, I want my own art to not like harmfully affect anybody else's profession or their art or anything like that. But I am not fully convinced, though, because this is such a new technology,
Mhm.
that it's that kind of cut and dry, you know. And I have some really devil's advocate questions for you
Yeah.
that are not necessarily like where I'm coming from, but they're just things that I haven't fully processed yet. Okay, so the big thing for me that I'm kind of stuck on, though, in terms of plagiarism slash almost theft of other people's work, right? Because it's uncredited work that's generated from other people's work. Though the devil's advocate part of that, it's not actually their work.
It's not as
And it's not
straightforward as plagiarism,
and
certainly.
it's not, yeah, and that's the kind of that's a big crux of it for me, is the user or the generator does have a part in this process, right? The thing that they make wouldn't have been made without their prompt. I'm not saying that that
Sure.
counts for much, but that is a consideration, right?
Sure, absolutely. And like I said, that's kind of the crux of the argument is like forming the prompt is the input of the human who's asking the AI generator. And that's a major like leg of the stool of the argument of, but I did make this, or I had a
Yeah,
hand in making this, or a human had a hand in making this. For in the, you know, going back to Zariah of the Dawn, like that's how that creator can claim like they asked the prompts, they knew what they were looking for, and they chose from the images that were the numerous, you know, you give a prompt and you get back numerous images. They chose the one and then they used that and then they went on to the next panel or you know whatever. That's sort of the major piece of that argument, that a human did have a hand in creating it. The AI is just a tool, like the program, you know, that you draw your whatever in. If I'm creating a digital painting and I
right,
open up my iPad and I turn on Procreate, like Procreate doesn't get credit for my painting. I painted it
right.
in Procreate. Well, I generated images in Midjourney and looked for the one that I wanted, so Midjourney shouldn't get credit.
I thought of that. Well, the immediate thing that popped into my head was like, if I were to do something along these lines, I would absolutely be transparent that what I made, I didn't sit down and draw. Like, it was made using these tools. I'm already like anticipating this whole introduction
Right.
about like disclaiming that.
Well, and here you are like an amateur creator working on a personal passion project. It, you know, if I am correct in saying from our long history of the things we've done, like you're not suddenly talking about something you want to publish or make money off
Well,
of. Like this is the realization of
yes.
a personal
But I mean,
project that's like an
I've
itch, like an
never been opposed, like just, you know, just like YouTube monetization and things. That's not my
yeah,
goal. If
yeah.
that comes, I'm totally for it. That's not the impetus to like
Okay.
for to be creative.
Right.
as you know.
To me, this feels like a long-term personal passion project that's like an internal itch that you're looking to scratch, and this is a means to
Absolutely.
do that. But it's still like it comes from a place of, generating the images. And again, this is Araya of the Dawn I go back to, or the Bestiary Chronicles, which is another one that we were talking about before. It's just like kind of a famous AI comic book. The recognition that comes with the completion of the project has to come then with that disclaimer of where it came from. And you have to remember that, like, for instance, Zaraya of the Dawn, it's very obvious that the main character in Zaraya of the Dawn is Zendaya.
Yeah,
Like, it's super obvious. Now, there goes her
I noticed
likeness
that.
in a way that she
Yep.
has zero control over, zero say over. And if we created a show that had her in it via AI, her like camp of people is rightfully going to be like, hey, wait a minute. And so that puts a lot of power into the hands of the creator. Now, if you had drawn those images, maybe that same argument comes up, but here I had access to, like, this creator didn't have the skill to draw that and still was able to do it. And so now it makes you have like a broader consideration of like, suddenly anybody can use anybody's likeness. And that becomes a wider conversation. Another piece of this, and I'm step onto your side for a second, the kind of devil's advocate side, is what I just described about scraping the internet for images and then using those images to inspire but not directly plagiarize other artwork. Isn't that what people do? Isn't that what human beings do?
That was something I was going to bring up.
It's another major like argument in the kind of like evolution of AI isn't what AI is doing just a digital version of what human beings do? In that I learned by looking at artwork of masters and amateurs and the full like range of history and spectrum of my own experiences and like all the artwork that I could. And now I can create artwork because I took all of that in and I make my own hodgepodge version of it, kick it back out. Am I a hungry, sleepy, bleeding version of an AI image generator? That's going to be something that we have to reckon with. But it's like the question of intelligence of like, it's hard to boil down how those inspirations then became the artwork that I create, where they stop and I begin, how much I put into it. Like you can tell if I sit down and I draw in the style of The Simpsons, anybody with an ounce of pop culture can say, hey, that's The Simpsons, you're ripping off their style.
Yeah.
But if I watched hundreds of hours of The Simpsons and then drew comics that didn't look like The Simpsons, but I was inspired by The Simpsons, where do they stop and I begin? That line is blurry in a human being because we're also inputting other experiences and our lived experiences and the other things that we are made of and enjoy. Like art isn't the only thing I'm interested in. And so those other things that I'm interested in and I love are going to inform the art that I make or want to make or can make. And that's something that with an AI is not actually a question. Where the scraped images and inspiration stops and the AI begins is actually a pretty, at least conceptually, knowledgeable line, in that anything the AI makes doesn't exist without those other things. If I had never seen any artwork ever and you gave me a crayon, I could still make lines. If you never showed an AI artwork ever and then told it to make a line, it would have no idea what you were talking about. So the reality is that it's not plagiarism, but it's as close as you can get without using the actual images, because the AI's output doesn't exist without the things that it scraped, whereas the human being is still capable, even if not, like I would never become even as minimally capable as I am now if I hadn't had that previous inspiration, but I could still draw. Like cave people didn't have access to like French painters, but they still drew on those walls. That question for me still boils down to the fact that, like, yes, we're doing that kind of same thing, but there is that question of where inspiration ends and the individual begins. But with an AI, that's not really a question.
I hear you.
But I do want to reiterate that I think where you are is where most people are, and even where the creators and detractors are. Like I, as a detractor of using AI, despite the fact that I hate gatekeeping, and AI is like one of the biggest breaking down of the gate in the art world in a long, long time, I still grapple with like, but people can create stuff with it. Doesn't that make it a tool?
That's something I keep returning to too.
Like, why should we not just then respond and adapt to its existence? People are terrible at grappling with ethical, moral questions, at least as a body, because like there are going to be people who just don't care, and so they're going to use it, which means it's going to exist. And I can kick and scream and yell at clouds all I want, but it's going to exist. So
Yeah,
shouldn't I just adapt? It's been unleashed, so there's no like putting that back in the jar. It has learned the way it has learned. And I may not like the way it's learned, but it did, and it's done, and people are going to use it.
that's why I'm wondering, like, what could it take to change your stance? Is it a
So,
credit thing? Is it because, like you said,
right.
it's not the technology's not going to go away, and as an artist, you're going to have to grapple with that too.
So there's no way to put the genie back in the bottle because all that artwork that's online, you cannot get everybody to agree to it. Like a lot of the body of work that's out there is deceased artists or artists who are no longer working or artists who are just never going to agree. And so the data set that most AI generators that your average person would have access to, that's done. You've done the unethical thing, and there's no going back.
That doesn't make it right
No, it doesn't. But
to
there
use to
is
still use
there's
it
no way
and
to
perpetuate it.
fix it. There's no way to fix it. You
But that's
know.
what I'm saying. Like, will you just kind of continue to decry using it on an ethical standpoint, or is there some of this that could make it better?
I don't know. I mean, I think the version that is better, there's probably some kind of in the same way that manufacturing is regulated, there's probably some kind of future copyright regulation that's going to come into play here.
Yeah.
And maybe you'll find AI generators take a step back before they can step forward because the creators might have to actually go in and remove data sets of copyright data that they scraped without permission. There might be some kind of opt-in that artists take when they put artwork online of like, can
Hmm.
this artwork now be
Oh yeah.
used to train AI generators? Anytime you post an image of anything anywhere, there might be a future where AI generators take a step back in order to take an ethical step forward.
Hmm.
And that's probably going to be some kind of governmental copyright regulation that comes down if it ever does. So I could see a future AI generator that is accepted and like okay, or that is, I don't know, might take some like coding genius that can work from smaller data sets or that can work from photographs in publicly available, like goes into what are some of the like really popular photo galleries that you can source from that's like either open source or like pay sourced.
Wiki Commons and stuff like that.
Yeah, like a Wiki Commons or I'm trying to think of, there's like a bunch of image banks that you can like Getty Images, like that kind of
Oh
stuff.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then it can still turn that into art looking things based on a data set of artwork that has been like given permission. So like I think there's a future to it. The other piece of it is, look, I'm really personally against it for my work and I would never do it. But any of these kind of moral questions, I mean, I say that now at this moment, any of these like moral questions of how art and tech gets used, I'm not going to judge somebody that does. Do I think Zendaya of the Dawn was, or Zariah of the Dawn was right to have its
Yes.
copyright removed? A Freudian slip there. Was right to
Yeah.
have its copyright removed? Yeah. Do I think it's good that the artist was able to keep his copyright on the story? Well, yeah, he created that. So like there might be a piecemeal thing of like we just accept that artists who use that can't get copyrights on the imagery but could on the story, in which case somebody might steal the images that you created via whatever, essentially stealing the work of others. And like that's just a thing that happens for a while until we're a few generations into it, and there are ones that are done better. We might never grapple with this. Human beings don't always ethically answer the ethical questions that are put to them, and it might just become ubiquitous and the people who whine about it die off.
I just find it interesting that you talk about people not being in control of their art and how it's being used and everything. But I feel like on the flip side, it is kind of ubiquitous now in terms of like viral culture, meme culture, just Google and using the internet and reposting and pretty much like anytime. And I understand, like you were saying before, like artists had no choice and they didn't necessarily even want to have their stuff just up and available and easily screenshotted or downloaded and shared. And it was supposed to be more proprietary, but that's been going on for a very, very long time.
It absolutely
Is
has.
it like anything that's on the internet is not like protected as much as we want to try, to say that it should be or could be or is.
Which is why I'm
You
not
know,
confident that there's an ethical future to
yeah.
this. And
I'm not saying any of it is right, but it's just kind of commonplace, like once something gets put into like a cultural zeitgeist,
think about people that
everybody's
unintentionally became memes, like
yeah,
the
exactly.
the sort of pained smile guy,
Oh
you
gosh,
know,
yeah.
the guy who holds his girlfriend's hand and looks back over his
Oh,
shoulder at somebody else. You know, those were
yeah,
stock images and they became super memes. Do you think everybody who became a meme like super agreed with it? No, not necessarily, but that's their image
yeah.
that's out there. This might just be a thing that is now, and artists might have to think differently about their work in response to it, in the same way that musicians had to when
I was gonna
streaming.
say,
And so then you get streaming, but you did get streaming platforms that, while we decry how little Spotify actually like, and how much money from a Spotify streams actually ends up in the pockets of musicians, Spotify was, and all the Apple Music, were responses to what Napster did.
right.
And so like maybe there's a future like that, where if you want to use create, generate AI, it's just not free.
Hmm.
And you pay a small service fee, and then that ends up in the, like, a penny a month ends up in the pocket of the artist whose images were scraped off the internet,
Hmm.
like maybe there's a future like that out there. I don't know. My general view on it is that it's just another artistic tool. And I have questions and qualms about personally using something like this because I know how it is capable of doing what it's doing. I'm also, in full transparency, I'm not nearly talented enough to be affected by this. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Like my artwork is not out there being scraped. So how
Wow.
angry I am or am not about it
Yeah.
is more conceptual than anything. So I'm not in a position to judge people who do or don't, or who are angry about it or who aren't angry about it. The best that I can do is I use my position as an educator who talks about comics and that visual storytelling medium with kids, because it's specific in the comic space and we're talking about comics. And I talk to them about it in my classes, about image generation and where it comes from with me, and then let them make their own choices, because that's about the best I can do.
Yeah. One more devil advocate question. Do you equate any of this to, because we were talking about, not like affecting people's, professions and affecting the integrity of these industries and the field? What do you think about like things like drum loops, and plugins, for all like in terms of music, where we don't need musicians to make that stuff anymore. Like you can have a band now, that's just one person, and but they don't even play all the, maybe they just a vocalist, and then they can just program all their music. In the past, that person would have had to go to other musicians, and now technology has taken that need away, and so possibly is taking money away and people supporting their families and stuff. Even my father mentioned earlier, a lot of the stuff that he used to do, even though it's interestingly kind of coming back around, but there was a period, basically from the turn of the century up until more recently, where more and more touring Broadway shows and musicals and such were not, they were just using canned music over the PA. They weren't hiring musicians for the pit because it was cheaper and fewer logistics and everything. Do you see this as like similar to that? And like, do you think that that is unethical, even though it's different because it's
There's
not
probably some
taking.
cyclical nature to this where AI becomes super ubiquitous and then art made by a person comes back around because so many people make digital art that, like it becomes in vogue to go like get somebody to actually design it. And certainly industries are going to have to adapt. You think about like logos. If I wanted logos for my company, I'd have to hire a graphic designer and they would meet with me and we'd talk, and then they would go and spend tons of time coming up with options, and I would get a handful of options and I would pick and I would pay them for their time and then license the logo from them, and they would get credit for that logo long term. And it would be an expenditure to get a logo, and then that person would get, if my logo became like widely known, they'd get notoriety and they'd get work off of that. And whereas now I go to an AI image generator and in minutes I can have hundreds of options that cost me nothing or next to nothing, and I pick one. So like there's an industry that's probably that's probably going to have to adapt. There are artists that are going to be out of work, and that part doesn't scare me because industries adapt. And like, think of how many jobs did the assembly line get rid of? And
The printing press. That's what I was something I was going to bring up. Yeah.
It is a shame when people invest their life in learning a trade and something comes along and it makes that trade obsolete. It is a shame. And it is the human cost of that kind of progress of technology and everything is real, and it affects real people, and that's unfortunate. And people as a whole adapt. We adapt, and that's why like the idea of like gatekeeping or tech replace like doesn't scare me, and you just kind of like shrug and say we move on to the next thing as a species. And like there probably is a future where AI art is an entire branch of art, and who knows where it gets its data sets in order to learn from, but it's a whole branch. And like I said, like it'll take over large parts of the industry, and then it'll become in vogue to get a human being to design it. And some future version of Nike will be able to say, well, a human designed our logo, and it becomes a selling point.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes up and down. And the first time a piece of AI art gets hung in a museum next to somebody else's art will be the beginning of lots of AI art being hung in museums. And then there'll be wings of art generated by human beings. That'll be a recognition point of the art in this wing. These are human paintings. And here's the AI wing. And you'll have the world's first world famous AI artist. That will be a thing. This is part of the future of artwork.
Like you said, the cat's out of the bag, the bottle's uncorked.
That's right.
It's no going back. Well, that brings us to where we can wrap this up, though, is moving forward with this particular project that I brought up earlier, my Kanaloa potential graphic novel that's been in development for a very long time. Is there something here that I can still move forward with all these ideas and philosophies and ethics and realities taken into consideration? Just having toyed around with it a little bit, I was disappointed with how interpretive like the prompts, even when I thought I was being very specific, how interpretive the prompts were. Like it was getting there, but it was like, man, this is gonna take a while. Like, and then I realized that like you can give it visual prompts yourself to then iterate off of. And so that's immediately when I thought of you. And knowing, because we had talked before, you said like if I ever wanted to follow through with this, we should talk. One thing though that I know right off the bat, which let me know if anything has changed, but we have other projects in the work that I'm also very antsy to keep working on and see output, in some form or fashion in the future. So I don't want to add another thing to that, especially like such a huge undertaking. But I thought maybe a nice compromise could be you still, being the concept artist, the main character, and maybe even sometimes, like backgrounds, initial art, and then me using AI to iterate on your art, which I understand will be taken from other people's too, but at least, it wouldn't be completely unoriginal and would be coming from a place of a vision that we shared as part of our collaborative creative process that we've always shared. We would work together to create original images that most likely you wouldn't have time to you create unique panels with each one of those images to recreate them every single time for every single page. But you started with you as a starting point, and I would stick as close to them and the vision and the spirit of them that we started with. And then also, like, along the process, I was thinking that there could be things like, especially if I just cannot get a prompt to work correctly, maybe, it could be a more like bringing in unique art for whatever the panel calls for. Could be more one-off things, so we could work together on that. But the bulk of the work would be iterations on the generative art that we started with. What do you think about that possibility? Like, would that change? Like, one thing I don't, I know you said that you would do whatever because of our creative relationship, but I don't ever want you to feel icky or like you're having to compromise on your morals and ethics to appease me, your friend, because that wouldn't be a very friendly thing to do. The honest question, like, I want to know if that's something you'd be interested in, and I'm totally willing to accept that you're not.
I mean, the short answer is like, until we started to do it, it would be hard to see how much is what.
Mm-hmm.
And, what we started to generate off of what platform, and understanding where that platform got its data sets from.
Okay.
Um, and then once you start to actually create, because, what's to stop us from, and what's the difference in, like, if we go online, we find a couple of photographs of people that we think look like the characters we want, and a photograph of the background of the character you want, and like use Photoshop to cut one out and put it on the other. Well, if you're AI generating, I can be more specific about what I want. Well, of course you can be more specific about what you want. It's learned on pictures of these things or artwork of these things. And so, like, it's understanding, like, how much of the process is original, hodgepodge, AI.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if suddenly you find that, like, you can generate entire pages in the AI, and we look into, whatever the platform is, and learn that it just like scrapes random stuff on the internet, well, then, like, the process itself leads you down the path of like, oh, this was so easy. Well, of course it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
easy. Like, it's all the things that we've been talking about. It's designed to be easy in that way for that reason. So you'd have to start doing it and see what's what.
Yeah, I mean, all of this is hypothetical because, we
Right.
haven't even, yeah.
Before the question. So what I told you, you had asked me if I would create character models for
Mm-hmm.
you. And then
As a starting point.
you would use the character models as the sort of visual prompt for the AI. And what
Yep.
I told you was that I wanted to be able to express my concerns, but that because of our creative relationship, you had asked me to create character models, and I would always do that for you.
Right, but if I were to use them in ways that you didn't feel comfortable with, I don't think that would be a
But
very
yes and no. Yes and no. If I create the character models knowing what you're going to do with them, but I've expressed my concerns over it and not said, no, you cannot use them for this. I've done that for a reason. I've done that because I've had the chance to express my concerns and still decided to create the character models knowing what you might do with them, because ultimately that's your choice. In the same way that when I put something out on the internet, I know it's possible that it might become a data set for AI. If I
mm-hmm.
put it on the internet, I've made the decision that like I may not like that or I might disagree with that AI, but like I know that that's a possibility. And I've still gone ahead and done it for whatever reason I've done that. I'm not going to be the reason why you can't see through a creative vision.
Well, no, this wouldn't be the reason why this is just one avenue, that I'm exploring
And as I had said before,
potential.
like there are like obviously I have thought about this and I've dealt with this and I've talked to students about this and obviously I've gone through a lot of like I'm not completely unaware of what is happening here, but I'm also not an expert in this space and I'm not ready to like put a firm foot down and say no. Like there may be
Then
whole aspects of this that I'm just not aware of.
maybe
Like with
even like trying this process and seeing where it goes would inform both of us better with more concrete. Maybe we find that, a couple pages in, it's ridiculous
I was
and not
literally just
even
about the same thing, say the same thing.
okay.
We might get a couple pages in and be like, you know what, this feels icky.
Hmm.
Or we might get a
Or
couple
we might
pages.
find the opposite. I don't know.
Yeah, who knows? I'm willing to
Okay.
experiment with it.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop because I think it's going to be a while before I need to rewrite the script anyway,
Hmm.
and I have lots of new story ideas and things that I need to work through. So it'll be a while before even. But in the meantime, I still want to kind of play around with it and visually. So maybe we can talk about like the just a simple starting point because either way, I need to develop the story more at some point because it's driving me crazy.
Starting with episode 3 of the Mobius cast, the original run of the Mobius cast, Jeremiah and I started the tradition that kind of ended there for a while, but came back when I started my next podcast journey with Musiccast, which was to feature some music at the end of a music-related podcast. So to keep that going, but make it more specific to the Mobius Project, for this episode will be the most recent recordings that the Mobius Project has done up till this point. And these are really special to us because it was the first time that the 3 of us that were the remaining members after our 4th member, Allison, left the band, and we were kind of rebooting ourselves in a way. So it was me, Jeremiah, and Ryan when we were coming up on the tail end of our time on Maui. But we've been working on stuff as a 3-piece. Some of that material is still in gestation. Jeremiah and I are continuing to work through and record some songs that came out of that time. But then, like dominoes falling, we one by one left the island, kind of went our separate ways on the mainland. And we hadn't made any direct music with our former bass player and categorically, scientifically, and undeniably the nicest, sweetest guy on the planet Earth, Ryan, for the 10 years that followed. But like a lot of us during the pandemic, we found some extra time on our hands and in need of some extra connection, which for us, one of the most natural ways to do that, of course, was to make music together. So we played kind of a game of telephone, as it were, where Jeremiah came up with a guitar part, gave it to us, and we added our parts to it. Ryan was on keyboard this time, though, not bass. And you can see the videos of those, I guess you could call them reunion videos, because it had been 10 years since the 3 of us had done anything together as a trio, on our YouTube channel, which you can easily get to by going to breathingunderwater.us. But here's the audio from the second of those 2 recordings, and I don't think it was ever given a name, so we'll just call this 2020 distance recording number 2.